This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
It's called male privilege, and in the 21st century, it could be holding men back from becoming needed allies and inclusionary leaders in business and organizations. That's according to Ray Arata, an award-winning diversity, equity, and inclusion leader and speaker. But he says there are simple actions to take to identify it, acknowledge it, and use it to become a better leader. He joins us for this Biz News interview podcast. Ray, what got you into this line of work in the first place?
Well, there's two parts of the story. There's the wake up call, and then there's the man in the mirror moment. So the wake up call happened in 1999 when the mother of my three children basically informed me she didn't want to be married to me anymore, and we had just moved into a brand new home. And 6 weeks later, one of my business partners, I had a financial consulting retirement plan practice in Silicon Valley. He went to another firm in the middle of the night. So it's turned him from friend to foe. One could say it was a betrayal of sorts. And I didn't have the ability, the acumen to deal with two pretty heavy duty emotional events. And so I stuffed them and went sideways for 6 months. And so one day, my manager in the financial services industry, of all places, called me out on my behavior. And he said, Ray, sometimes you act like out of control, and that's not the Ray I know. And the way he said it, I said to him, my wife has given me feedback along these lines, and now I'm hearing it from you. I think I need to do something. And this is going to sound weird, but thank you for calling me out. So he said, come into my office, and he hands me a brochure. And I look at this, and I'll spare you the expletive, but I looked at him and I said, what the bleep is this? And he smiled and he said, can't tell you what to do there, but here, call my wife. It changed my life. So on trust, because I was desperate, I went to this weekend in Texas, Houston, Texas. And I can tell you now that what this weekend was, hosted by the Mankind Project, it was a initiation into what I would call healthy manhood, by men, for men, non-denominational. And in short, the weekend, when I netted out, it had me look at how the pained little boy in me was driving the adult bus and how I was impacting those I love around me. And so this set me on a journey that is now somewhere around 15,000 hours I'm working with men, leading 55 men's weekends, going into maximum security prisons, thousands of cups of coffee with men or women that knew men that needed to take a look at themselves. And so that's the wake up call part of the story. And I decided to write my first book called Wake Up, Man Up, Step Up, Transforming Your Wake Up Call to Emotional Health and Happiness. And along the way, I met a diversity and inclusion consultant who said, Ray, you really have something here. The men in corporate America or in the business world need to hear from you. You look like them, you sound like them. But first, I want you to go to a women's leadership event and just listen. You might be the only guy there. So I went to this event. I was the only guy there. And man in the mirror moment hit me. I realized my Italian-born mother had always said her brother always got all the rights and privileges and opportunities to go to college, this and that, because he was a boy, and she didn't. And then I thought of my wife, who was the oldest of 7 in an Italian family here in San Francisco, where the youngest brother was running the business. I made up a story about that, but be that as it may, it got my attention. And then last but not least, my daughter was going to be graduating from Duke with a degree in computer science. So I realized, I needed to do something. I could keep doing these men's weekends, or I could walk across the metaphorical street, knock on the door, get in conversation with CEOs and leaders. And with that, after, 6 or 8 speaking engagements at women's leadership conferences, I said, somebody needs to do something. Somebody needs to do something. Maybe this somebody needs to do something. And so I had this idea to advance healthy masculinity as a cornerstone of the leadership conversation. Unbeknownst to me, I was basically stepping into the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I called several men and women I knew at companies like Price Waterhouse, Kaiser Permanente, Genentech, and others, and said, I've got this idea. What do you think? They said, sounds good to me. A couple of them wrote big enough checks for me to host the first Better Man conference in 2016. Michael Kimmel was one of my keynotes. Jeff Halter, another guy on the Northeastern corridor who does some of this work. I walked backstage at Michael Kimmel's conference. I met Sheryl Sandberg and Jennifer Siebel Newsom, the filmmaker, the first lady of Governor Newsom, and said, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. Can you help? So with that, the conference was born. This was pre-Time's Up, pre-Me Too, and we've now done 13 conferences. And so if we come to present day, and this for your listeners is really important to understand, when Time's Up, Me Too, COVID, Black Lives Matter all kind of came together, they formed what I call a perfect storm. And so right now, the spotlight is on the majority, men. Now, there's been a minority of men, the bad apples, the one we see in the news, that have historically controlled the narrative. So now many good men and companies that have good men are sitting in the question, what do I do? How do I engage the men? And then for those that don't identify as men, they want to support and be supported. So when I wrote the book, I wrote to all three of those constituencies. I'll hit stop there, but that's a long-winded and hopefully necessary answer to your question.
You make it sound that it has gone swimmingly from the first idea. Have you had obstacles to overcome? If so, what?
About 15 fetal moments that I had crawled up into a ball, like, why am I doing this? No one's listening. So yes, so it's every year I thought, this is the year. This is the year. Nope. So banging the drum, banging the drum, banging the drum. And right now it feels different, probably due to the perfect storm that I mentioned just a moment ago. And so, and at the same time, here I am last week of February, and this has been the quietest January and February that I never imagined. So all the emails and attempts to reach out to all my relationships in corporate for either my book or the Better Man conference, crickets. So I reached out to a couple of them by phone and I said, what the hell's going on? I said, here's the story I'm making up. Can you really give me some insight? And they said, well, Omicron threw everybody for a tizzy. And a lot of us are in this wait and see. There's pent up work that we need to get done. And so this whole time, every 3 or 4 days, a company shows up with that look in their eyes, like, tell us what to do. So we've had 100% close ratio on the conversations we have had. That's never happened. So I'm very, very, very encouraged now because this work is more mainstream and it's in the spotlight. And I don't think it's going to go away.
Give our listeners and viewers an idea of what happens when you go into a company with your training program. Who do you train and what do you train them to do or not do?
Yeah, so what happens is I usually either a woman that runs the employee resource group says, this is great. I want to bring you in to either do a keynote conversation, but several years ago, I realized, that was just short-sighted. And so I said, is there a male ally in the executive suite that you can partner with? He is the one we need to be talking to, because we all need to recognize that this is a behavior change endeavor. Companies want to win the war on talent. So for your listeners, regardless of the size of business, for them to be aware that if they want to win the war on talent and get really good people, they have to have a culture that is inclusive. And so when we go inside a company, some of these companies are older. So there's cultural sludge in these companies. So I want to go right at it and say, we need to train your senior leaders and so that they can walk the talk, so that the middle managers, a big parts of your audience, sees them walking the talk, which they'll begin to emulate. So probably the best thing I can do right now to share with your listeners is that there's a framework we use. I speak to this framework in the book. It drives our training, and in essence, your listeners can hear this and contemplate on their own as they consider stepping into being an ally or an inclusionary leader or owner. So those 4 steps are: acknowledge your stuff, which basically means acknowledge that you have bias, privilege, understand that your emotions can and often do drive your behavior. And for men, we were never taught how to experience our emotions. And the 4th one is the man box, those set of unwritten rules of what it means to be a man. So for example, you could go to a schoolyard and ask young boys, what are some of the, what does it mean to be a man? And they'll say things like, don't show your emotions. Real men make all the decisions. Real men play sports. Real men are heterosexual. Real men aren't handicapped, and on and on and on. So when we shine the light simply from a place of awareness that all these things are going on, that we as men need to become more aware of, our eyes start to open. Second step, listen with empathy and compassion. This particular step is all about understanding the lived experiences of others. So my experience as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual guy is different than a gay person in a company, a woman or a woman of color, or a Black or Latin man. And so when I hear what it's like, the burden, the challenges that they face every day, and I understand that I don't face those, well, I start to have some empathy. And what most human beings will say or think, feel, do, or all of the above is, I had no idea, what can I do? That's a good thing when they say that. And they can start to step into use privilege for good. Third step, take responsibility for the impact of your bias or privilege, and when necessary, clean it up. So we're all human. We might say something that lands wrongly on someone. We might do something, or we might not say something, and there's impact. And so this particular step allows me to educate our clients on intention versus impact. So if I said something that offended you and you told me, and when you told me, you took the risk to tell me, if I said I didn't mean it, that centers me again, and it invalidates your experience, as opposed to, I had no idea. Tell me a little bit more. I'm sorry that it landed on you that way, right? Got to put the ego aside. So these are very necessary steps. And the 4th step is commit to new practices and behaviors. So these 4 steps that I walked you through, in essence, when I go inside a company, I talk to leaders about, this is the walk you need to do so that others see and experience you. And then before you know it, your culture can begin to shift to one of inclusion, where everyone's going to bring their full self to work, and you're going to get the maximum output from your employees.
Let me use a do-it-yourself analogy, if I may. You're painting a wall and there's something smeared on it, and you put a coat of paint over it. Well, you put a coat of paint over it, but after it dries, you can still see it. And then you have to put another coat of paint, and maybe a third. So how many times do you have to do this with a company to make for permanent, long-term change?
So with all due respect, I would not paint over it. I would get the scraper, and I'd shine the light on that which is there, and help people see how it, the cost of doing it that way and the impact. And then there could be a rewrite. So the answer, the longer, aside from my fun little answer there, in my book, there's a chapter called the multi-year game plan that I speak to professionals who are considering this. And I invite them to consider there's a number of things to do along the way, that this is not a one and done endeavor. So it takes a little while. And if you make a commitment that this is important enough, and you have senior leadership commit, and they do a training. You train the middle managers. You have occasional conversations. You have metrics. You decide, what's the needle that you want to move, and you step into sustainable efforts to keep this awareness and these practices and your commitments to have an inclusive culture. It'll take a while. So, 2 to 3 years. And, years ago, nobody was interested. I was banging the drum, and a few companies were listening. It's changed now. So, whether you're Toyota, Verizon, Bloomberg, Intel, Cisco, these people know these companies. They get it. And when Intel announced that by 2030, 40% of their leadership positions will be held by women, that requires them to do something culturally. When Price Waterhouse said, we're going to have 80,000 of our men sign up to be he for she male champions, they have to back up that commitment with education, right? So those are bigger examples, but I understand your listeners are smaller, which makes it actually a little bit easier, because you don't have such a huge enterprise and you don't have to undo 50 years worth of sludge.
You sound like the Roto-Rooter man. Well, give us a couple of examples from your past prior to the COVID shutdown of so much stuff that you can point to as good examples.
Yeah, so prior to COVID, so when I talk to companies, I ask them, where's the pain? Is this conversation we're about to have about pain or possibility? And oftentimes they say it's a little bit of both, but I'll give you an example of a company answering a wake-up call. So Hearst Corporation, one of their executives had to step down as a result of sexual misconduct. And so the way the company responded was, we're going to find out what's going on inside the company. Is this pervasive, or is this just an outlier scenario? And they found out that there was sentiment inside the company. So they stepped up. They sponsored our conference. They hired us to put 70 leaders through a training, and they went off on their own diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. That's an example of a company responding to the wake-up call, per se, that was put in front of them. Bloomberg, another example, we had done some work for them locally here in New York, and they asked us to go to London to meet with their editor-in-chief and to do a training for a bunch of their senior execs in the newsroom. And we conducted some interviews with women and with men, and we asked them the same set of questions. We allocated an hour for each meeting. And after 20 minutes, the men's calls were over. They're like, everything's fine. We have a meritocracy. Things are going good. The women's calls went an hour. We heard a whole host of things like, men are promoted on potential, women are promoted on merit, women need training. I mean, there were all these things that were said. And so we created this slide that said the tale of two companies. And the DEI folks that hired us did not want us to show this to their CEO. And we showed it to him, and he said, not only am I glad that you shared that with me, that's the first slide that I want to stand up and speak to in front of the room. And when we went around the room, most of the men said, I had no idea. Oh my God, what can I do? And so this was all pre-COVID. And I could tell you this story 100 times. That's just an example pre-COVID where a lot of companies who are willing to lift the lid and really find out what's going on. These very same men are fathers, husbands, partners, sons, and they want to be better. And when they find out, provided it's put in front of them without shame or blame, that this is going on, and it is going on, it is going on, then when they make that personal decision why this is important, and every man has a different personal reason, then there's possibility. So hopefully those are some examples that speak to you per your question.
Quick question. When you lift the lid, aren't there a small army of attorneys trying to hammer it back down before any of it gets out to the public?
I've dealt with some of that, but these are companies that when they choose to do a training like this, they've vetted it through legal. They've picked the men to attend, and they take it seriously. And I'm an attorney by degree, so I just, I help them circumnavigate that. And sometimes it's a necessary evil. It takes a little bit longer to get things off the ground.
Yeah, reformed attorney, as we sometimes call them. Would you tell our listeners the name of your new book, please?
Yeah, it's called Showing Up: How Men Can Become Effective Allies in the Workplace.
And where can they get this?
They can get it at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or a whole host of other places on the internet. Now, if they choose to go to showingupbook.com, which is our landing page, we have a nice little bonus available for them, meaning if you order the book, you will also, there's a process to follow, get a virtual ticket to one of our 2 Better Man conferences. We're going to be doing one, I believe, in June and one in November. And so they can sign up and we will reach out to them when the date is certain. And a lot of people seem really interested in being able to attend the Better Man conference, which is where it all started.
Ray, you've been really generous with ideas and examples, but what would you like to add that we haven't talked about?
I think one of the areas that has been present for me a lot, that keeps coming up, at the risk of speaking the obvious, is I'm a white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual guy. And which means a lot of companies have a lot of men in that identify just like me. And so I've been asked a lot by women of color, gay folk, to come in and speak to their white men. Not with shame, not with blame, but to help these guys do the right thing, to help these guys be better leaders. And so I just finished writing a blog that I speak to my white male ability as opposed to my white male fragility, which I help the white male readers and listeners understand that, given that we have privilege, unlike a lot of other people, which is akin to advantage, we can use accountability, and our privilege is what I call the dynamic duo of allyship. So it's an invitation for white guys to say, listen, ask yourself, how do you want to be experienced by other people? Do you want to be experienced as an inclusive, or do you want to be the curmudgeonly white guy who wants to keep the good old boy club to yourself? And that's not the world we're living in. Ask your kids, ask your friends. So without blaming you, I'm inviting white men to be courageous, to be inclusive, to come from their heart, to be considerate, and to be one of those white guys that everybody else sees as one of the good ones. So this has been coming up a lot. And so I've been working on, how do I use my privilege and my platform? Because I was too young during the civil rights era. So my commitment now is, regardless of what other white guys will think of me, they might kick me out of the boys club. They might tell me to shut up. Who knows what they'll say. I'm going to follow my heart, and I'm going to do the right thing in support of my friends of color.
You've been watching the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.